Hello and welcome to the CDO Magazine interview series. I'm Susan Wilson with Informatica. I'm the Vice President of the Data Governance and Privacy segment, and we are partnering with the CDO Magazine, MIT CDO IQ, and the International Society of Chief Data Officers in a series of interviews. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Cathy, Chief Data Officer for the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Cathy, welcome, and maybe you can do an introduction for our audience today.
Absolutely. I am as you said, the Chief Data Officer for the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. And my everyday job is making sure that my businesses have the data they need, that it's easy to find and ready to use.
Good organizational and program design are critical for good governance. And good governance means good business outcomes for an organization. Any best practices on creating your governance program and that operating model? You talked a lot about the business and making it meaningful. So what are some of the things you'd like to share?
Sure. And, it is, I guess, my world, I live in two time frames. So, right, what we've done to date, and what are we going to do differently going forward? And I love to think about governance and privacy from a this day forward perspective. And so how, as you're doing, let's just pick on the cloud modernization, right? How do you build governance and privacy into the fabric of the way people are doing their jobs as they're moving data to the cloud, moving applications to the cloud? If we're replatforming things, can you use that opportunity to make the data better as you take it over? Don't just lift and shift yucky data. It's like, oh, we have an opportunity here to standardize it. And one of the things that I've seen is effective as putting good data handling, I'll put it that way, good data handling practices into the system development lifecycle. How do you actually make sure that everyone that's involved in that, whether they're business folks, they're technology folks, operational folks, how are they doing something different that's being thoughtful about the data so that it does serve the business when you get there? And to me, governance is about making it work. And by the way, when it's not working, right, let's just say you envelope it into the systems development lifecycle and you see, hey, once again, it's all about measurement. It's all about the data and analytics, but it's, oh, well, this piece isn't working, right? We're not getting to quality data. What's going wrong? How do we go back and fix this? And so I think it's the monitoring of what's working and not working from a governance perspective. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. I envision like it's an assembly line of data or that data pipeline, and just you've got those folks looking at making those checks, both for quality as well as making sure the privacy that's top of mind, the compliance is being addressed, because the need. I mean, I remember, back in the day, we used to have these centralized teams that it's almost like a concierge for data that you would ask them, I'm looking for this data. They would go back and massage it and give it to you, sometimes days, weeks, months later. Now self-service is like it is a standard, and we're looking to enable, like you talked about earlier, enable my business functions around how data could be helpful for their businesses. And that demand for data is growing. In fact, this next question is, how do you balance, right, the need for greater data sharing and that self-service with the need for security and privacy compliance? So how are you addressing that?
Yeah, so this is, I'll have to say, this is my favorite question. So, so once again, think about a spectrum where, and I have seen this, all of these occur in my career, where you free all the data, right? You want that self-service, but there's pros and cons associated with that, right? Somebody could be building a credit model and misuse data because they don't know what they're working with, right? The data's all out there. I can go do whatever I want. Or worse yet, you end up in a place where, Susan, you and I produce reports on the same thing, but they're conflicting, right? You knew something I didn't know. I took out a population of people, you didn't. And our data says that it's the same thing, but it actually is not. And so then senior leadership gets involved because we're creating conflicting information. So that's the one extreme of free all the data. And oh, by the way, doesn't take care of security, privacy, that sort of thing. And then the other extreme is lock it all down, right? We want to make sure nobody misuses it. So Susan, I have to come to you to ask for permission. That's assuming I even know you have the data, right? That is a world that does exist for many people. It's all locked down, nobody shares, and you only learn through the telephone game who has it and what it means. And it really, the limitation on that is the business doesn't get out of it what it could get out of it, because they may not know it's there. And if they did know it was there, they may not be able to convince you to give them access to it. So that's the two extremes. And I live in the world of let's free the well-managed data. Let's make sure that we bring in the data, that we catalog it, that we know what it is and where it is, what it means, whether or not it's sensitive, how do people get access to it, and who do I call when I have a question, right? Can I call Susan and say, hey, could I use this in a credit model? And you go, absolutely not, and explain to me why, and then I'm better. And oh, by the way, the more that we could do this digitally, right, be able to cross communicate about the data, the person who sits next to me may be asking the same question next week. It's all right there for people to use. And so I really do think it is knowing what you have, and knowing who to get in touch with, and knowing what sensitivity level it is, and having one place where everyone can go to actually find it. And my correlation to that is, right, you can't go into a library without a card catalog and find what you're looking for. It's like, hey, Susan, where's that book? Oh, it's over in that far right-hand corner. The same thing with our data, right? You don't want to be in that place of either extreme of the data is just out there for the taking, or it's all locked down. You really want to free the well-managed data, not just free the data. So.
Right on. And I think you hit on some number of excellent points. You know, by having the visibility, the transparency on what data do I have, having the right business context, the people context to it, creating those human connections, the data connections are also critically important in terms of us being able to do the data sharing. As data leaders, we need to have that full view and make available the things that we know that are well curated and well known, while we're still nurturing perhaps maybe the less curated data that maybe has some value, but we're not yet sure. And we're still working those things out in terms of the standards and whatnot. But that visibility, that transparency is critical, you know, and being able to offer that. You know, the other thing that I also find too is that I'm seeing the chief data officer connecting very early on in their programs with their compliance officers, the privacy officers. Sometimes those roles are with other individuals within the organization. And so earlier upfront on the data program, so the way we're all invested in that approach versus the lockdown. I love that spectrum that you offered too, because there's pros and cons, and each industry and organization needs to think about, where are we on that spectrum? What do we want to be in terms of how we're data sharing and thinking about data to our enterprise? So great points there. Last question is, these programs are a marathon, not a sprint. They're not a quick win. It's not a project, it's enduring. There's so many things that you talked about already in terms of the cultural aspects connected to business strategy. All those things are important to keep in mind. You know, it can be a bit wearing, right? You know, right? The average tenure is about 2 years for the chief data officer. Sometimes I think they get a bit of burnout as a result of the change, the high expectations. Cathy, how do you keep momentum? How do you keep momentum for yourself, for your team, and that stakeholder buy-in that you need going in over time? So what's your advice there?
I think first I would say start small. I think it's very easy to get caught up in, we need to govern everything, and it just becomes cumbersome and complicated. It is a marathon. It is not a sprint. And I really do think it is about being attuned to where your organization is. I don't preach data maturity, but I think we all know what I mean when you sort of look at the spectrum of, I don't even know what data I have, to I'm the analytics leader in the industry. But I think it's making sure that you're making the governance relevant to where you're at, keeping in mind from this day forward. And, what are we doing about what's happened behind us, right? Are there things that we need to do, or can we age off things because it's been so long? And I really do think it comes back, and I keep saying this, it's about measurement, right? Can we show that we're making progress? Can we show that we're adding value? And then fine tune and, stay relevant to the business. And once again, it's about that practical versus perfect, right? You really are trying to make sure that you're instituting good practices over time. Susan, you just mentioned, the risk and the privacy. One of the things that we're working towards is that we're interchangeable. We have a risk team, we have a privacy team, we have the data office, but it's like, can we speak for each other while we're out so that each one of us is not necessary for a conversation? And we're finding great success with that. And so I encourage others to think about that as well, which is, can you as a data officer speak to the risk, speak to the privacy? Doesn't take away from what the risk officer is doing and what the privacy officer is doing. But the more that we can all stand in for each other, I think that also helps with organizational adoption, which I think is what this is all about, versus you're in violation of XYZ policy, blah, blah, blah. I don't find that works to, obviously sometimes you have to do that, but I think more about we want people to build these good behaviors into the fabric of the way they do their jobs. And governance should be looking at saying, is it working? Is it not? Then what do we need to do to fix it?
Yeah, like that. In terms of that alignment, you just talked about, you're interchangeable. That means you focused a lot on alignment, sticky alignment, that we not only see the same things, we can speak for each other. It translates to actions across the board. I think that those are all critical points, really critical points, especially as you're beginning your program or coming back to look at your program and saying, I need to refresh this. Are we aligned? Are we congruent? Do we have the right plan? All key things. And you don't just do it once, you do it over time. Do it constantly. So Cathy, gosh, it's such a pleasure having you today. I want to thank you so much for your insights. Thank you. And for our audience today, please visit cdomagazine.tech for more of Cathy's interviews, as well as additional interviews from other CDOs as a part of this series. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for having me, Susan.
Thank you, Cathy.